The lights of Las Vegas were still glowing when Elvis Presley stepped out of the black Cadillac. It was late summer 1969. Inside the International Hotel, thousands of people were already waiting. Some had traveled across the country just to see him. Others had come from places Elvis himself had never imagined reaching. They had heard the rumors. Elvis was back. Not the young man from the 1950s. Not the television idol from years ago. This Elvis was older, stronger, more confident. And tonight, he was going to prove that the stage still belonged to him. But nobody inside that enormous showroom knew that Elvis was about to face a challenge that would have nothing to do with rock and roll. It would have nothing to do with his famous moves. And it would have nothing to do with screaming fans. It would be about something much more personal. Something Elvis had carried inside himself since childhood. Gospel. And the man waiting to challenge him was Johnny Cash. Elvis walked through the backstage corridor wearing a white suit. The rhinestones caught the light every time he moved. His hair was perfectly styled. His face looked calm. But behind that calm expression was a man who understood exactly what was at stake. He had spent years away from the kind of stage he truly wanted. Hollywood had changed him. The movie business had changed him. The years had passed. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt like coming home. His musicians were preparing their instruments. The sound of drums echoed through the walls. Guitars were being tuned. Technicians rushed from one side of the room to another. Then Elvis heard a familiar voice behind him. Well, Elvis turned. Johnny Cash stood in the doorway. Black shirt, black jacket, that unmistakable deep voice. Elvis smiled. Johnny. Cash nodded. Thought I'd come see whether the rumors were true. What rumors? That Elvis Presley still knows how to scare a room full of musicians. Elvis laughed. I'm just trying to get through the night. Cash walked closer. For a moment, the two men simply looked at each other. They had known each other since the days when music was played in tiny rooms, and nobody knew what their names would someday mean. Back then, they had been young, hungry, restless, and desperate to be heard. Now one stood as the king of rock and roll. The other had become one of the most recognizable voices in American music. But beneath the fame, they were still musicians. Still boys who remembered where they came from. Cash looked toward the stage. You nervous? Elvis raised an eyebrow. Me? Yes, you. Elvis smiled. Maybe a little. Cash laughed. Good means you still care. For a few seconds, neither man spoke. Then Cash said something that changed the mood completely. Can I ask you something? Sure. When was the last time you sang gospel in front of a crowd that didn't already know what you were going to do? Elvis's smile disappeared. He looked at Cash carefully. What are you getting at? Cash stepped closer. I've watched you rehearse. And you've got the band, the lights, the orchestra, everything. Cash paused. But there's one thing nobody can hide behind. Elvis waited. Your voice. The room suddenly felt quieter. Cash continued. So tonight. He pointed toward the stage. I want you to forget all of it. Elvis stared at him. The lights. Forget them. The band. Forget them. The audience. Cash shook his head. Forget what they expect from you. Elvis crossed his arms. And what exactly are you asking me to do? Cash looked directly into his eyes. Sing gospel. Elvis didn't answer. Cash smiled slightly. Live. A question for you. Before we continue, tell me something in the comments. If you were sitting in that Las Vegas audience in 1969, would you want Elvis to sing a powerful gospel song with only his voice and a piano? Type yes or no in the comments. And tell me where you're watching from, your city and country. If stories like this keep you interested, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, because what happened later that night would become the moment neither Elvis nor Johnny Cash could forget. Elvis finally broke the silence. Johnny. Cash waited. You know I sing gospel. I know. I've been singing it my whole life. I know that too. Elvis looked down. That's different. Cash understood immediately. Different. That was exactly the word. Gospel wasn't just another style for Elvis. It was connected to memories, churches, family, his mother, his childhood. Before the fame, before the screaming crowds, before the expensive cars and hotel rooms, there had been a little boy in Tupelo who listened to church music and dreamed of becoming somebody. A little boy who didn't know that millions of people would someday know his name. Elvis took a slow breath. I don't sing those songs the same way anymore. Cash's expression softened. Maybe that's why you should. Elvis looked at him. What does that mean? It means maybe you've spent too much time singing for everybody else. Cash paused. Tonight, sing for yourself. Those words hit Elvis harder than Cash expected. For a moment, Elvis looked away. Then he smiled. You always were a troublemaker. Cash laughed. That's what people say. Elvis shook his head. You're trying to get me into trouble before my show. Maybe. Then Cash gave him one final look. But I think you're afraid. Elvis's eyes narrowed. Afraid? Yeah. Of what? Cash answered quietly. That they'll hear the real Elvis. The smile disappeared from Elvis's face. That sentence stayed between them. Neither man spoke. Outside, the roar of the audience grew louder. Thousands of people were chanting Elvis's name. Elvis. The walls seemed to shake. Elvis slowly turned toward the stage. He could hear his introduction beginning. The band was ready. The audience was ready. The world was waiting. But now there was one question inside his mind. Could he stand in front of thousands of people without hiding behind the spectacle? Could he sing the music that had belonged to the boy before the legend? He looked at Cash one last time. Stay close. Cash smiled. I will. The announcer's voice filled the room. Ladies and gentlemen. The audience erupted. Elvis closed his eyes for 1 second. Then he walked onto the stage. The reaction was immediate. People screamed. Women cried. Men stood and applauded. Camera flashes filled the room. Elvis smiled and waved. The band began. The first notes exploded through the showroom. Elvis moved with confidence. He joked with the audience. He sang. He laughed. The room belonged to him. For several minutes, everything was exactly what people expected. The superstar. The lights. The energy. The voice. Then Elvis looked toward the side of the stage. Johnny Cash was standing there. Watching. Waiting. Elvis saw him. Cash didn't say anything. He simply raised his eyebrows. A silent question. Are you going to do it? Elvis looked back at the audience. Then something unexpected happened. He raised one hand. The band stopped. The crowd became confused. A few people laughed. Others began whispering. Elvis walked toward the piano. The stage suddenly felt enormous. Without the music, there was nowhere to hide. He sat down. The microphone stood in front of him. Thousands of faces stared back. Elvis touched one piano key. A single note filled the room. Then another. He looked down, and when he finally spoke, his voice was softer than anyone expected. I've been singing these songs. He paused. Since I was a kid. The audience became completely silent. Elvis swallowed. My mother used to love them. For the first time that night, the superstar disappeared. There was only a son remembering his mother. A young boy remembering a church. A man remembering the place where his voice began. Elvis looked toward Johnny Cash again. Cash was no longer smiling. His expression had changed. He knew exactly what Elvis was doing. And he knew this was no longer a performance. Another quick poll. Be honest. Do you think Elvis should continue singing when the emotion becomes this personal, or should he stop before breaking down? Comment, keep singing, or stop. And if you're enjoying this story, hit like, subscribe, and share where you're listening from. Because the next few minutes would change the entire atmosphere inside that room. Elvis placed both hands on the piano. His fingers trembled slightly. Then he began to sing. Not loudly, not dramatically, just honestly. The first line floated through the room. The audience stopped moving. No screaming, no cheering, no applause, nothing, just silence. Elvis continued. His voice grew stronger. The sound seemed to travel beyond the showroom, beyond the lights, beyond Las Vegas itself. Johnny Cash stood motionless at the side of the stage. He had heard Elvis sing before, many times, but never quite like this. This wasn't the voice of a superstar trying to impress an audience. This was the voice of a man remembering something he had almost forgotten. Elvis closed his eyes. And for one brief moment, he was no longer in Las Vegas. He was somewhere else. A small church. Wooden benches. Warm sunlight. His mother's voice. His own younger voice singing beside her. He remembered being poor. He remembered not knowing what the future would bring. He remembered the feeling of believing that music could save you. His voice cracked slightly. The audience noticed. A woman in the front row covered her mouth. Another person began crying. Elvis opened his eyes. He looked toward the crowd. And suddenly, he understood something. They weren't waiting for Elvis Presley anymore. They were listening to a man. A human being. A son. A believer. A musician. And Johnny Cash. He was beginning to realize that he had made a mistake. He hadn't challenged Elvis to sing. He had opened a door. And now neither of them knew what was waiting on the other side. Elvis continued singing. The final notes were still ahead. And somewhere in the darkness behind the stage, Johnny Cash quietly wiped his eyes. Because he already knew. This wasn't going to end like an ordinary concert. The final note hung in the air. For one strange, unforgettable moment, nobody moved. Nobody clapped. Nobody shouted Elvis's name. The entire showroom seemed frozen. Elvis remained seated at the piano, his hands resting gently on the keys. His head was lowered. He could hear his own breathing. Then, from somewhere near the back of the room, a woman began to cry. It was quiet at first. One sob, then another. A man beside her reached for her hand. And suddenly, the silence broke. Not with screams. Not with the wild applause Elvis was accustomed to, but with thousands of people slowly rising to their feet, one after another, until the entire room was standing. Elvis looked up. His eyes were shining. He seemed almost confused by what he was seeing. Then the applause began. Softly, slowly, and then louder. Much louder. Elvis stood beside the piano. He didn't make his usual gesture. He didn't throw his scarf. He didn't smile for the cameras. He simply looked at the audience. And then he looked toward Johnny Cash. Cash was standing at the edge of the stage. His arms were folded, but his eyes had betrayed him. They were wet. Elvis walked toward him. The applause continued. When Elvis reached Cash, he leaned closer. "You happy now?" Cash laughed through his tears. "No." Elvis raised an eyebrow. "No." Cash shook his head. "Now I'm scared." Elvis smiled. "Why?" "Because you just made me cry in front of everybody." For the first time that night, Elvis laughed. A real laugh. The tension finally broke. But Cash wasn't finished. He stepped closer. "You know what the problem is." Elvis looked at him. "You were right." "About what?" "I said they needed to hear the real Elvis." Cash shook his head. "They needed to hear the real themselves." Elvis became quiet again. Because he understood. The song had not only reminded him of his childhood. It had reminded thousands of people of something they had lost too. A mother, a father, a home, a church, a childhood, a person they could never see again. That was why the room had become silent. Everyone had been remembering something. The band members watched from behind them. They had expected another Elvis performance. They had expected energy. They had expected the usual Vegas spectacle. Instead, they had witnessed something deeply personal. One of the musicians lowered his instrument. "Man," another musician whispered. "I've never heard him sing like that." But Elvis wasn't finished. He turned toward the band. "Let's do another one." The musicians looked at each other. Cash smiled. "You're going again." Elvis nodded. "Yeah." Cash asked. "Same song?" Elvis shook his head. "No." He looked down for a moment. "Something my mother used to love." The room became quiet again. Elvis returned to the piano. This time, he didn't sit immediately. He stood there, looking at the crowd. Then he said, "When I was a kid, I didn't have much. A few people smiled. But we had music." He paused. "And we had each other." His voice became softer. That was enough. Johnny Cash lowered his head. He knew that sentence wasn't meant only for the audience. It was meant for Elvis himself. Quick audience poll. Let's pause here for a moment. What do you think is more powerful in music? A technically perfect voice. Or B, a voice filled with real emotion? Write A or B in the comments. And tell us what city and country you're watching from. If this story is touching you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves classic music. Because Elvis was about to sing the song that would make Johnny Cash lose control completely. Elvis began again. This time his voice was stronger. The piano followed him quietly. No huge arrangement. No dramatic drums. Just Elvis. The first verse moved through the room like a memory. People who had been cheering moments earlier were now sitting perfectly still. A man in the front row removed his glasses and wiped his eyes. An elderly woman held her hands together. A young couple leaned toward each other. Even the photographers stopped taking pictures. They seemed to understand that flashes would ruin the moment. Elvis continued. His voice rose, then fell. He wasn't performing for the people anymore. He was telling them something. Something about where he came from. Something about losing people. Something about holding on to faith when life became difficult. Johnny Cash watched from the shadows. He had heard gospel music his entire life. He had performed it. He had written about it. He had lived through moments where music was the only thing keeping him standing. But what he was hearing from Elvis was different. It wasn't polished. It wasn't perfect. And that was exactly why it hurt. Then Elvis reached a difficult line. His voice suddenly weakened. He stopped. The piano stopped. Elvis looked down. The audience waited. For a second, it seemed like he might walk away. Cash took one step toward the stage. But Elvis lifted his hand. No. He shook his head. I've got it. He took a deep breath. Then started again. This time his voice was almost a whisper. But somehow that whisper reached every corner of the room. Cash's eyes filled with tears. He looked away. He didn't want anyone to see. But one of the musicians noticed. Cash wiped his face with the back of his hand. Then he looked at Elvis again. And Elvis saw him. Their eyes met. No words. Just understanding. The song ended. Silence. Then applause. But this time, Elvis didn't stand immediately. He remained seated. His head lowered. The applause became louder. People began shouting his name. Elvis. Elvis. We love you. Elvis finally stood. He looked overwhelmed. He raised his hand. The crowd quieted. Then he said, "Thank you." 2 simple words. But his voice cracked. He looked down again. And then something happened that nobody expected. Johnny Cash walked onto the stage. The audience erupted. Cash approached Elvis slowly. Elvis smiled. Cash didn't say anything. He simply reached out his hand. Elvis took it. Cash pulled him into a hug. The audience exploded with applause. For several seconds, the 2 legends stood together. One in white. One in black. 2 completely different styles. 2 completely different journeys. But the same love for music. Cash whispered something into Elvis's ear. Nobody in the audience could hear it. But Elvis's expression changed. His smile disappeared. He looked directly at Cash. What? Cash repeated it. Elvis shook his head. You're serious? Cash nodded. Elvis laughed. You've got to be kidding me. Cash stepped toward the microphone. The audience waited. Cash looked at Elvis, then at the crowd, and said, "You know what I think?" The room became silent. I think one gospel song isn't enough. The audience cheered. Elvis laughed. Cash continued. I think these people deserve to hear where that voice really came from. Elvis looked at him. Johnny. Cash pointed toward the audience. Tell them. Tell them what? Tell them about the boy. Elvis stopped smiling. The words hit him hard. The boy. That was the one thing Elvis rarely allowed the world to see. The world knew Elvis Presley. The world knew the costumes, the cars, the movies, the records, the fame. But very few people knew the boy underneath all of it. Cash knew, because he had met him before the world did. Back when they were both young. Back when nobody knew what they would become. Elvis stared at Cash, then slowly walked back toward the microphone. The audience waited. Elvis took a breath. My name wasn't always enough to fill a room. A few people laughed softly. Elvis smiled. When I was a kid, nobody knew me. He paused. And honestly, he looked down. I didn't think anybody ever would. The audience became completely silent. Elvis continued. There were days when we didn't have much. His voice softened. But my mother would sing. He smiled. And when she sang, he paused. I believed everything was going to be all right. Johnny Cash looked down. His jaw tightened. Elvis continued speaking. I think that's why I still sing. The room was silent. Because somewhere inside me, he touched his chest. That little boy is still listening. Cash closed his eyes. That sentence broke something inside him. He looked away, but the tears were already coming. One more question. Before we move forward, if you could ask Elvis Presley one question on that stage in 1969, what would you ask him? Write your question in the comments. Maybe someone reading it will choose the most powerful one. And if you're still watching, like the video, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Because Johnny Cash was about to do something that Elvis never expected. Cash stepped toward Elvis again. You know what I remember. Elvis looked at him. Cash's voice became quieter. I remember a young man who didn't care about being famous. Elvis smiled. I cared a little. Cash laughed. Okay, maybe a little. The audience laughed too. Then Cash's expression became serious. But you cared more about being heard. Elvis looked at the floor. Cash continued. You wanted people to feel something. Elvis nodded slowly. That hasn't changed. Cash smiled. That's what I wanted to hear. Then Cash turned toward the audience. You see this man standing here. The audience cheered. Cash waited until they became quiet. He doesn't need me to tell you he's Elvis Presley. The crowd laughed. But tonight, Cash looked at Elvis. I want you to remember something. He paused. Before the king. Another pause. There was just a boy. Elvis's eyes became wet. Cash continued. And that boy. His voice broke. Still has the voice. Cash stopped speaking. He looked down. For the first time that night, he couldn't continue. The audience became silent. Elvis slowly stepped toward him. He placed one hand on Cash's shoulder. Cash looked up. And then Elvis said quietly, Come on, Johnny. Cash shook his head. I can't. Elvis smiled gently. Yes, you can. Cash wiped his eyes. The audience began applauding. But Elvis wasn't asking him to leave. He was asking him to stay. Because now Elvis had an idea. an idea that would change the rest of the night. He looked toward the musicians, then toward Cash. "Let's sing one together." Cash stared at him. "Together?" Elvis nodded. "Yeah." Cash smiled through his tears. "What do you want to sing?" Elvis looked toward the piano, then toward the audience, and quietly answered, "Something we both know." The musicians began preparing. The crowd leaned forward. Johnny Cash stepped beside Elvis, and as the first notes began to play, nobody in that room knew that the most emotional moment of the night had not happened yet. It was still coming. And this time, Johnny Cash would not be able to hold back. The first notes filled the room. Elvis stood beside Johnny Cash. For once, there were no dancers, no dramatic entrance, no flashing lights, no roaring guitar solo. Just two men standing beneath the warm stage lights, preparing to sing music that had followed them since childhood. Elvis glanced at Cash. "You ready?" Cash smiled. "Are you?" Elvis chuckled. "You started this. I know. And you're going to regret it." Cash laughed. "Maybe." The piano began again. A slow, familiar gospel progression. Elvis closed his eyes. Cash lowered his head. And then they started singing. Their voices were completely different. Elvis's voice was powerful, warm, almost overwhelming. Cash's was deep, rough, and unmistakably human. But together, something strange happened. They didn't compete. They blended. The audience became completely silent. People who had come expecting entertainment were now witnessing something much more intimate. Two men remembering where they came from. Elvis sang the first verse. Cash followed. Then Cash's voice cracked slightly. He stopped for half a second. Elvis immediately looked at him. Cash continued. But Elvis knew. Something was wrong. This wasn't simply emotion from the song. Cash was remembering someone. Someone who wasn't there. Someone from long before the fame. Someone he had lost. Elvis knew that look. He had seen it in himself. He leaned closer. "You okay?" Cash nodded. "Keep singing." So Elvis did. The second verse began. And this time, Elvis didn't sing toward the audience. He sang toward Cash. Cash answered. Their voices moved back and forth across the stage. The crowd watched. Nobody screamed. Nobody wanted to interrupt. A few people were crying openly now. The musicians had lowered their volume to almost nothing. They were allowing the voices to carry the entire performance. Then Elvis reached a line about returning home. His voice slowed. Cash looked at him. For 1 second, neither man sang. They simply looked at each other. And Elvis suddenly remembered the young man he had known years earlier. A young Johnny Cash. A young Elvis. Young men with nothing but dreams. They hadn't known what fame would cost. They hadn't known how lonely success could become. They had only known that music was their way out. And now, years later, they were standing together on a Las Vegas stage, surrounded by thousands of people. But somehow, they both looked lonely. Quick poll for everyone watching. I want to ask you something. Which voice would you choose for a gospel duet? Elvis, powerful and emotional. Johnny Cash, deep and raw. Or would you choose both together? Write your answer in the comments. And don't forget to tell us where you're watching from, city and country. If you're enjoying this emotional story, hit like and subscribe. Because what happened next was the moment Johnny Cash completely lost control. The song continued. Elvis sang softly. Cash answered. Then Elvis suddenly changed the melody. The musicians looked at each other. They hadn't rehearsed this. Cash noticed it too. Elvis was improvising. He was no longer following the arrangement. He was following his emotions. Cash smiled. He understood. So he followed Elvis. The two voices rose together. The room seemed to become smaller. Thousands of people disappeared. There were only two singers, two memories, two lives, two boys who had once stood on the edge of a completely different world. Elvis's voice grew stronger. Cash answered. Then Elvis reached the final phrase. He held the note. Cash joined him. For several seconds, their voices remained together. Then, silence. The piano stopped. Elvis lowered his head. Cash stood motionless. The audience waited. And then someone began clapping. One person, then another, then hundreds, then thousands. The applause became thunderous. Elvis looked at Cash. Cash smiled, but his eyes were full of tears. Elvis reached for his hand. Cash grabbed it. They turned toward the audience together. The crowd rose to its feet. A standing ovation. But Cash still hadn't recovered. He looked toward Elvis and whispered, "I wasn't ready for that." Elvis smiled. Neither was I. Cash stepped toward the microphone. The applause slowly faded. He looked at the audience, then at Elvis. His voice was quieter now. "You know," he paused, "I came here tonight thinking I was going to challenge this man." The audience laughed. Cash smiled. "I thought I was going to see if Elvis Presley could still strip everything away and sing from the heart." He looked at Elvis. "But I was wrong." Cash swallowed. He didn't need to prove anything. The audience became silent again. Cash continued. "He reminded me." A pause. "He reminded me why I started singing." Elvis's expression changed. Cash looked down. "And I think..." His voice cracked. "I had forgotten." The audience watched. Cash wiped his eyes. "I've spent years standing on stages." He took a breath. "I've sung in front of thousands." Another pause. "I've sung in front of millions." He looked at Elvis. "But tonight..." His voice broke. "I remembered the little boy who used to sing because it was the only thing he had." Elvis's eyes filled with tears. Cash continued. "And that's what you did tonight." He pointed toward Elvis. "You brought him back." The room went silent. Elvis couldn't speak. He simply nodded. Then Elvis walked toward Cash. He put his arm around him. The audience applauded softly. Cash leaned into Elvis's shoulder for a moment. He tried to compose himself, but the tears continued. Elvis whispered, "It's all right." Cash answered, "No, it isn't." Elvis looked confused. Cash smiled through his tears. "It's better than all right." Then he laughed. A shaky laugh. The audience laughed with him. And suddenly, the heavy emotion lifted. For a few seconds, they were simply two friends laughing on stage. Then Cash said something unexpected. "You know what?" Elvis looked at him. "I think we owe them one more song." Elvis smiled. "Another one." Cash nodded. But this time, he looked toward the band. No piano. Elvis raised an eyebrow. No piano. No piano. What then? Cash pointed at the audience. Let them sing. The crowd erupted. Elvis smiled. All right. The musicians stepped back. The lights dimmed slightly. Elvis walked to the front of the stage. Cash stood beside him. Then Elvis raised his microphone. Everybody. The crowd became quiet. If you know this one. He smiled. Sing it with us. A guitar began softly. Cash started the first line. Then Elvis joined. The audience slowly began singing. At first, only a few voices. Then hundreds. Then thousands. The entire room became one giant choir. Elvis looked around. His face was completely transformed. He wasn't performing anymore. He was listening. The audience was singing back to him. Cash closed his eyes. He listened too. The sound was enormous, and yet strangely peaceful. Then Elvis turned toward Cash. Cash opened his eyes. They smiled at each other. Neither man needed to say anything. The challenge was over. But something much deeper had happened. One last question before the finale. Imagine you're sitting in that audience. Thousands of people are singing with Elvis and Johnny Cash. Would you be singing along, or would you just sit there crying and watching? Comment. I'd sing. Oh, I'd cry. And tell me where you're watching from. If this story has kept you with us this far, please like the video, subscribe, and share it with another classic music fan. Because the final moment of this night would become the memory neither man could ever forget. The final chorus approached. The audience became louder. Elvis's voice rose above the crowd. Cash joined him. Their voices met again. This time there was no sadness. There was gratitude. The final note came. Elvis lowered his microphone. Cash lowered his too. The crowd erupted. Elvis looked at Cash. Cash looked at Elvis. And then Cash hugged him. Not the quick embrace of two performers. A long embrace. The kind that said everything words couldn't. Cash whispered, "Thank you." Elvis answered, "For what?" "For reminding me." Elvis smiled. "You reminded me first." Cash pulled back. "What did I remind you of?" Elvis looked toward the audience. "That I was still a boy before I became Elvis." Cash stared at him. Then nodded. "That boy is still in there." Elvis touched his chest. "Yeah." He smiled. "I think he always will be." The audience applauded again. Elvis turned toward them. "Take care of yourselves." Then he looked at Cash. "Take care of him too." The crowd laughed. Cash shook his head. "You're impossible." Elvis laughed. The two men stood together beneath the lights. White and black. Rock and country. Two legends. Two friends. Two men who had started with almost nothing. And for one night, they had forgotten everything except music. As the lights slowly began to fade, Johnny Cash wiped his eyes one final time. Elvis noticed. He smiled. Still crying. Cash shook his head. "No." Elvis laughed. "You're a terrible liar." Cash looked at him. "Maybe." Then he smiled. "But tonight, I don't care." The lights went dark. The audience continued applauding. And somewhere behind that applause was a simple truth. Johnny Cash had challenged Elvis Presley to sing gospel. But in the end, Elvis didn't just sing for the audience. He sang for the boy he used to be. And Johnny Cash didn't break down because Elvis had failed. He broke down because Elvis had reminded him of something he thought he had lost forever. The reason he started singing in the first place. The applause continued long after the music stopped. Elvis stood quietly beneath the fading lights. Johnny Cash remained beside him. Neither man seemed ready to leave. The audience had witnessed something completely different from the show they had expected. There had been no spectacular ending. No wild performance. Just two men standing together, remembering where they came from. Elvis turned toward Cash. "You all right now?" Cash smiled. "I'm better than all right." Elvis laughed softly. Then Cash looked toward the audience. "You know something?" The room became quiet. "I came here tonight to challenge Elvis." The crowd laughed. Cash continued. "But I think he ended up challenging me." Elvis raised an eyebrow. "How?" Cash looked at him. "To remember why I started singing." Elvis became silent. Cash placed a hand on his shoulder. "And I think every singer needs that reminder sometimes." For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Elvis smiled. "Come on, Johnny. Where's? Let's get out of here before you make me cry again." The audience laughed. Cash shook his head. "You're the one who started this." "I know." They walked toward the side of the stage together. But before Elvis disappeared behind the curtain, he stopped. He turned around, looked at the thousands of people, and simply said, "Thank you for listening." The audience erupted one final time. One final question. Before you leave, tell me in the comments. Did Johnny Cash's challenge make Elvis's performance more powerful? And most importantly, where are you watching from? Write your city and country below. If this story touched you, like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves Elvis, Johnny Cash, and the golden era of music. Behind the curtain, Cash looked at Elvis. "You know." Elvis turned. "What?" "I think that little boy you talked about tonight." Elvis waited. He never really left. Elvis smiled. "No." He looked back toward the stage. He just needed somebody to remind him. Cash nodded. The two men shook hands. Then they embraced one final time. No cameras. No audience. No applause. Just two old friends who had spent one unforgettable night reminding each other why music mattered. And as Elvis walked away, Johnny Cash quietly whispered, "Sing it from the heart, Elvis." Elvis turned around and smiled. "Always." The hallway lights slowly dimmed. The crowd outside was still cheering. But inside that quiet backstage corridor, the night had already become something neither man would forget. Johnny Cash had dared Elvis Presley to sing gospel. And instead of proving that he could sing, Elvis reminded everyone why he had started singing in the first place.